Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the winter session of the Freedom Project. It is my pleasure, pardon my voice, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, and also a great honor to have the opportunity to teach in the same department with him, Dr. Craig Murphy. He is currently the acting chair of Africana Studies, and Betty Freyhoff Johnson for the Professor of Political Science. He joined the faculty of Wesley College in 1981. He is a distinguished scholar that needs no introduction, but I will just mention a few of his accomplishments that are selected from a very long list. He was the founding director of the doctoral program in global governance and human security at the University of Massachusetts in Boston in 2010 and 11. He is also a fellow of the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study and was a visiting scholar at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences in 2012 and 13. In 2000 and 2001, Craig served as the president of the International Studies Association and was honored as its 2013 Distinguished Scholars in International Political Economy. He also served as chair of the Academic Council of the UN System 2002 and 2004, and was a founding editor of its journal, Global Governance, which received the 1996 Association of American Publishers Award for the Best New Scholarly Journal in the Humanities, Management, and the Social Sciences. His most recent book, Engineering Rules, Global Standard Setting since 1880, is co-authored with MIT's Joanne Yates, and it just recently came out from Johns Hopkins University Press. Other recent books include a Portuguese translation of International Organization and Industrial Change, Global Governance since 1850, which came out in 2004, and I wish there was a Turkish translation when I was writing my master's thesis in Turkey, because there was only one copy that was in Istanbul, and I had to travel all the way there to just have the chance to read the copy, and it became it. And his other books that came out in 1990s and early 2000s all became my reference books for my master's thesis and then for my PhD thesis also. And also, recently, a Japanese translation of the UN Development Program, A Better Way, came out in 2014. It's my pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Craig Murphy.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's an honor to be able to talk to you and to be able to talk about my recent research with Joanne Yates, who happens to be my wife, as I'll mention in a bit. The research is about something that may seem really weird. It's about something called industrial standards. So industrial standards are little documents, sometimes very long documents, 500 pages, sometimes just 1 or 2 pages, that define how something should be done, how a particular product should be made, or how a particular service should be done. And there are like about 150,000 or so of these standards. And the standards are implicated or involved in literally everything in the constructed world that has been constructed since, say, the First World War. So if you look around this room, which was built about the time of the First World War, but everything, almost everything you actually see is part of the reconstruction of the building at later periods of time. Everything, there's a document, an industrial standard, or multiple ones associated with the height of this thing, the type of material that's being used here, this plastic that looks like the materials that are in the floor here. There are about at least 200 really important industrial standards that are inside that computer. There are about 200, believe it or not, that connect all the electrical systems in the room. They're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. And they were all created in exactly the same way. And they're all created in the way that the Freedom Project should love, because they're voluntary. So all of these standards, whether it's the standard for the noise reduction in this microphone, or whether it's the standard for the European size of my sweater that I'm wearing, were created by little committees of engineers. And the committees are engineers are people who supposedly volunteer their time to do this, that's freedom, and they represent three groups of people. They represent the companies, primarily, they're companies, that produce the good or service, and so engineers representing companies that produce the stuff, engineers representing the major purchasers, the organizations that are major purchasers, and engineers who represent the common interest. So you've got 150,000 of these standards out there. You have about 150,000 technical committees that work on the maintenance of these different standards. You have sitting in these committees engineers representing companies and the public interest. They're created by, the committees are created by many, many different organizations, which I'll talk about in a minute, and they shape virtually everything. The committees work on the basis of consensus. So if any of you have had to do projects with other students at Wellesley, you have to work on the basis of consensus, cooperation. It's hard. Daniel Tiger will tell us how hard it is. Mr. Rogers. In any case, they work on the basis of consensus. They produce these documents, and then the standards are adopted voluntarily. The only reason that this thing connects to that thing is because the companies have voluntarily adopted some standard. Okay? So, at the end of the talk is going to be about kind of the system. At the end of the talk, I want to raise a set of two questions that are absolutely critical to the current period. One are questions about the openness of the internet and the World Wide Web. Because the internet is actually governed by voluntary consensus standards. Everybody in government hates that. The Chinese government hates that, the US government hates that, the European Union government hates that. It's a huge problem for governments. So that's question number one. And then question number two is, it turns out, we live in this world, throughout the lifetimes of all of you who are students, we live in a world where global manufacturing is commonplace. When I started teaching at Wellesley in 1981, almost everything in this room would have been manufactured within 200 miles of this place. Now, almost everything in this room, every piece of clothing, the furniture, even this stuff that's been put on the walls in the reconstruction, is manufactured on the other side of the world. That's the global manufacturing system. There is no regulation of the global manufacturing system except voluntary consensus standards. So that's question number two. Is that a good thing or not a good thing? Okay, so standards are ubiquitous. They're actually governed by, they work in the same way from one place to another. They've been doing this since these engineers have been doing this since the 1880s. And as of 2006, no one had written a comprehensive history of this system. So, that woman who's standing right there, whose name is Joanne Yates, who is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management at MIT's Management School, and is someone who probably has broken more glass ceilings than almost anyone you've ever run into in your life, who is one of the most distinguished historians of management in the United States, and also the first woman to ever kind of run a major management school, and a few other little things like that. The third woman to ever be tenured in MIT's management school, long before, by the way, any woman was ever tenured at HBS, but we'll leave that aside. Joanne and I, she's this historian of American business, I'm someone who does this stuff on global governance. We decided to threaten our marriage by collaborating to write this history. And we succeeded in doing it. The book came out last year. In the book, which I'm going to talk about a bit, we talk about really those things that are on the first two major points. We talk about why standard setting of this sort was established, which is really because governments didn't want to do it. We talk about three waves of this standard setting and the institutions involved and the consequences. And then I'll talk about those things, and then we'll get to these conflicts with government, primarily and essentially with the internet, and what I would call when government is essential, which has to do with some of the issues associated with global manufacturing, where there isn't anything going on. So, to begin, why on earth are all these little committees? Has anybody ever heard on any of these little committees? Anybody have parents who are engineers? And no parents have gone off to some weird place like some place in, you know, here we are in Florida. I'm going to be gone for a couple of weeks to talk about stuff. Okay, fine. And, anyway, yeah, there are hundreds of thousands of people who do this, and they're mostly engineers, right? Pretty weird. Joanne and I have come from families of engineers, and actually nobody in our families been involved in standard setting. So it was pretty weird when we started thinking about this. In any case, standards. Why would you need these darn standards? Well, it turns out that after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it was very clear that there were needs for standards. And Enlightenment governments, such as the government of revolutionary France and the government of the United States of America, decided that obviously we need things like a single system of measurement, right? That's a standard. That's a basic metrology standard. We need to have some simple way of measuring things that's the same everywhere. And we need to have some things like interoperability standards. You'll see that on the cover of the book, this is like the quintessential standard from the Industrial Revolution. If we were sitting around in 1776, every stupid machine shop in the United States and everywhere else in the world made their own screws. If you wanted to have screws that fit from one thing to another, you had to use the ones from the machine shop where the thing that you were constructed in the first place were made. Governments that wanted to promote industrialization wanted standards. And so you can go and read Alexander Hamilton. You may have heard of him. It's like there's a show about him. Alexander Hamilton, it was a great, you talked about Alexander Hamilton probably in the Freedom Project sometimes, no? No? Okay. Anyway, Alexander Hamilton was a great promoter of manufacturing, as well as the guy who wrote, you know, the Federalist 65, which everybody should be reading right now, which tells you about what's going on in Washington at this moment. Alexander Hamilton wanted standards. George Washington, who was the conservative guy he worked for, wanted standards. The US Constitution in Article 2 says, Congress will set standards. George Washington, in his first address to Congress, said, guys, you haven't gotten around to setting standards. The first time Congress ever bothered to set even metrology standards, measurements, was in 1893. In 1893, in one single state, Ohio, there were 15 different measures of the inch that were all legal. Finally, in 1893, the United States adopts the metric system, which, by the way, is the only legal system that has ever been adopted by Congress. And yet, the thing has never been enforced. The last time we adopted the metric system was in 1979. We elected President Reagan the next year, and he decided to not fund it. The transition of our conventional systems to the legal system, and so we still are the same way we are. Now, why? Can anyone think about why? Democratic governments, the U.S. government, the French governments. The French government, by the way, didn't adopt its own metric system, invented in France for the revolution and all that kind of stuff, until it had an authoritarian government in the 1860s. Why is it that democratic governments, which is where most industrialization has tended to take place, don't like to adopt standards or even create them? Think about your Congress people. Think about your people in your local government. Why would they hate to do that? They really hate it. Because somebody loses. Every time you adopt a standard, you're going to have constituents who were using some other system who are going to have to change what they were doing. And if there's one thing a democratically elected person hates, it is making any of their constituents upset. You know, they don't have to make their constituents happy. You might notice in the US we don't do that anymore. We don't even spend too much time thinking about it. But people hate making constituents mad. So governments, even though these standards seem terribly important ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, didn't do it. Engineers, on the other hand, thought it was a good thing for them to do. This is the 19th century, 1800s, Engineers thought it was a good thing to do because engineers wanted to become gentlemen. Gentlemen. So back in those days, if you were a person who was not a lord or lady, but wanted to be treated as a gentleman, you needed to be in one of the professions. You needed to be something like a college professor. They were gentlemen. Or more typically, you needed to be a clergyman. Or you needed to be a lawyer in a distinguished profession. And the way you proved that you were the type of person who was deserving to be a profession was to do things in the public service. Many fields that became professionalized in the 19th century became professionalized by doing public service. And the big thing engineers did to create public service was they created standards. And many of the standards that they created were created by individuals who would create like a whole new system of screw threads, screws that would fit one way or another. There's one heroic person in the US who did that, one heroic person in Britain. Or they created safety standards. In the 19th century, one of the biggest safety problems, it's kind of like Boeing, but different. In the 19th century, there were all of these ships that were going up in boats, going up and down rivers and across the sea with steam boilers on them. And it was faster and all that kind of cool stuff. But they blew up often and killed lots of people. So one of the basic places where engineers started to create standards was to create standards for boilers. You may have heard of something called boilerplate. Well, boilerplate is the stuff that's on the side of boilers. It's the steel on the side of a boiler. And boilerplate is the standard that you put in your, that are invented by engineers, and you stick your boilerplate in standard into your contract to say, this one's going to be safe, so maybe we should use that. So boilers were a safety standard. So you've got these heroic individuals and engineering societies. And that works for a while, but it stops working when you start having so many standards that seem to be needed. More and more and more and more and more things. And it also stops working because it turns out that engineers had a tendency to create the perfect standard from an engineering point of view, because they're good engineers, and nobody would adopt them. So in the 1880s, simultaneously on two sides of the Atlantic, but in correspondence with each other, two different organizations created the process that we now use everywhere. One organization is the American Society of Testing Materials, and this chap, Charles P. Dudley, who was the chief chemical engineer of the Pennsylvania Railroad, thought up this process and thought up the organization. And across on the other side of the Atlantic, at the Technical University of Munich, this very happy-looking man, Johann Bauschinger, thought up the same thing. Mostly, both of them were concerned about a very practical issue, which was railroads were trying to figure out whether to invest in the new steel rails rather than iron rails, and they weren't sure whether these new steel rails actually were cost-saving, so they had to figure out things about the nature of these rails and standards for the rails that would make them cost-saving. And they came up with this idea that there should be a committee with working by consensus that has high-quality engineers representing the producers of the junk, the rails, the railroads, which were the major purchaser of the rails, although governments were also purchasers. The biggest purchaser of rails at the time that they were coming up was actually the government of India. The Raj, the British government, purchased more rails than anybody else did, so it was a government agency. And then university professors of engineering who represented the common interest. And that's the system that we've had ever since then. And it turns out that the standards get adopted because the key players are represented, the stakeholders are represented in the process. All right, so that's the process that's invented, and then a weird thing happens. The engineers stop thinking, who are involved in standard setting, stop thinking about standard setting just as a way to show that they support the public interest. You start to get lots of engineers saying, standard setting will save the world. that if we have good standards, we will save so much money in production that the conflict between the capitalists and the workers will disappear. If we have so many good standards, we'll save so much in production that we'll be able to have prosperity everywhere and world peace will break out. And you get this global movement of engineers promoting standard setting and promoting the creation of standard setting bodies throughout the entire industrial world. And it's a global movement. Everybody's corresponding with each other. Everybody's talking with each other, much more in certain ways than people do today, usually by mail, but nonetheless in correspondence. And there were two really key figures in this. And the last one, we had a German and an American. Here we're going to have a Brit who's sort of French, and another German. So Charles Lemaitre was a British citizen, an electronical engineer, somebody who worked with electric wires and that sort of stuff. He happened to be born in the Channel Islands of Britain, which meant that his first language was French. First language was French. He was totally bilingual. And Charles Lemaitre became the person who promoted the idea of standard setting bodies all over the world. Primarily in Britain, where BSI, the British Standards Institute, was created, in his own field, which is the International Electrotechnical Commission, in France, not surprisingly, in the United States, across what we call the Commonwealth, and also Charles Lemaitre in the early 1920s was promoting in the USSR the creation of a standards body within that country as well. All of these places, and Sweden and a whole bunch of other places, say Charles Lemaitre was the founder of their organization. Across in Germany, Waldemar Helmich, who created what most people consider the best national standards body, DIN, the Deutsche Institut der Normung, was doing the same sort of thing. And they're both of the same generation. He was particularly important across Europe, continental Europe, what the British like to call Europe, Latin America, and again, the USSR. The USSR, they're very upsetting because in the USSR they can't decide which person was the most important for the creation of standard setting. Was it Helmich, who is usually celebrated, say, in Turkey, for example, along with the next person, or was it Lemaitre? And they have to say both of these people, one German and one Brit. This first wave of standardization, where they thought they were saving the world, really lasts until the Second World War. Lasts until the Second World War. You have engineers everywhere thinking about this. And they have a number of major achievements. The first big achievement is they created national standard setting bodies, these bodies that create these technical committees in all of the industrialized and industrializing countries before the Second World War. So if you're going to go anywhere in the world where modern industry was taking off, which is pretty much, there was a standard setting body created by this network of engineers who were going to save the world. Okay? So that's number one. Number two, they created a couple of international organizations. One of them is the International Electrotechnical Commission, which is really important for things like creating the networks of electricity that cross North America or Europe or cross China. They connect because of the International Electrotechnical Commission. And then they created a broadly based international body that only operated for a short period of time, but did create a number of standards, like all of our film standards were created by something called the ISA, which I won't even tell you what its name was. But maybe the most important thing is, according to many historians of development, economic development, the standards created by that first wave of standard setting organizations are absolutely essential for everything that we think of as the benefits of industrialization that people have gained. So Robert Gordon, big fat book, economist at Northwestern University, argues in The Rise and Fall of American Growth that the quality of life, the improvements in the quality of life in the US, in Europe, in Japan, everywhere in the developing world today, including China, blah, blah, are associated with a set of technologies that he calls the first networked home. And the first networked home are houses and apartments connected to networks of water and sewer. That's what raised life expectancy. Not our doctors or anything. It turns out it's clean water and being able to get the shit away. That's the big thing that achieved that. Electricity, light. Gas, heat. Phone, communication, radio. The streetcars and buses, transportation. The rail systems. Even the standards associated with early civil aviation were all done by this group of people before the Second World War. The economist Paul Krugman, similarly, he's that guy who writes in the New York Times and writes snarky things all the time. At one point he says, the whole world that's trying to develop, what they really would like is the equivalent of the house that my parents had in Levittown in 1947. And that is actually the thing that created, and I know that many of you who are younger think that things like the computer, and especially the cell phone, have improved your lives. Nothing. There's no way that that has any connection to the way your lives have been improved by this other stuff. So the first group of standardizers, this is the thing that they accomplished. Okay, that was the first wave. So here's the second wave. The second wave is all about global manufacturing. At the end of the Second World War, during the Second World War, you can imagine the good guys and the bad guys. That is, the good guys, of course, were the Western Alliance and the United States and Britain and all that kind of stuff, because we won. We actually were the good guys. They didn't cooperate that much on standards with the Germans during that period of time. But as soon as the war ended, the major standardizers on both sides of the Atlantic, on both sides of the divide between the Axis and the Allies, reestablished an institution for global standardization. And it was kind of the last gasp of Charles Lemaistre and Waldemar Helmich. Helmich is a very important person in the history of Germany because he broke with the Nazis in 1933, and in 1946 really brought the German engineering profession on both sides of the Berlin Wall to a reevaluation of what had happened during the Nazi period. So they created a thing called the International Organization for Standardization, which is abbreviated as ISO, I don't know why. And ISO played a key role all the way until the 1980s in creating global manufacturing. And much of this key role was done by this guy right here, a Swedish engineer called Ole Styren. And I'm going to take just a minute to say things about Ole Styren. So Ole Styren. Ole Styren did many, many things. That's him without the hair. Ole Styren was a Swedish modular engineer. This should be really easy for people to understand. When you think about Sweden, what do you think of? IKEA? Yeah. When you think about Sweden, but the biggest thing of Sweden in most people's lives is the big blue store that has all the modular stuff. That was part of the Swedish development plan after the Second World War, and it was to create things that would, cheapen the cost of homes and that sort of thing. And there's even a wonderful, funny social science movie about it called Kitchen Stories, 2003. Which is really, really boring, and you get to see people because it's deliberately boring, because it turns out figuring out how to create the best modular furniture is really boring. And you have people like Ole Styren who are figuring out how to do that stuff, because that was in the Swedish national interest. So that's what Styren wanted to do, but he wanted a job, rather than working for companies like IKEA, he wanted a job that would give him more time to play tennis. And so he started to work on standardization. And he spent some time with the United Nations in Ankara, Turkey, helping the Turkish engineers create the Middle East Institute of Technology, which is the big university for engineering in in Turkey, as well as the Turkish National Standards Bureau. And he got really into internationalism at that point, which is why when he became head of ISO after 1969, he spent most of his time making sure that there were national standards bureaus created in every country around the world. My favorite is the Botswanan Organization of Standards, which is called BOBS. He ran a bunch of organizations, or started them, the Swedish Standards Institute. He started the European Union related standards institutes then, and he was the most important secretary of the ISO. His big thing was international standards. When he worked on international standards, he wanted to create a global economy, so his biggest thing that he was promoting was creating containerized shipping, which we'll get to in a second, but he also did a bunch of other things like figuring out how to have standards not be a barrier to trade, a non-tariff barrier to trade. He was the first person to start working on the internet standards, getting ISO to do that. And he was the first person to sort of push things like environmental standards, which are all sort of later things. Here's the big one: containers and global manufacturing. This is one of these things that I really hate because I study intergovernmental organizations and intergovernmental cooperation. And I'm one of these political scientists, and there are a lot of people who work in things like the Freedom Project who think things like this. They think, oh my God, if we could just get rid of government regulation like tariffs and that sort of stuff, everything will be better. And if you're like me and you think about this, intergovernmental organizations, that sort of thing, you think about the World Trade Organization and NAFTA and all of that groovy stuff, the impact of all of the governmental abolition of trade restraints is about 1/7 of the impact of lowering costs of trade than a single set of standards. The container standards, which lowered the port costs of transportation by 93%. The reason we're all wearing Chinese clothes isn't because Bill Clinton used every bit of political capital that he had to create the World Trade Organization, which Freedom Project people should love because they're rid of. It's because Ole Styrin and the people in the companies involved in transportation and in the production of these containers totally changed the costs of shipping from one place to another. That's why it's cheap enough to have everything in this room come from East Asia rather than nearby. So, Ole Styrin, container standards, that's kind of impact of the second wave. So here's the third wave. The third wave is standard setting associated with the internet and the World Wide Web. There are organizations that manage the internet and the World Wide Web, and they work essentially the same way as all these other standardization organizations. So this guy in the corner down here, that's Tim Berners-Lee, who is the real inventor of the World Wide Web, unlike Al Gore, who said he was the inventor of the internet. And what Tim Berners-Lee did is he created a standardization organization. He created an organization that maintains all the standards of shifting information from one place to another. And by the way, he did it in a different way than what Ole Styrin and ISO wanted to do. It's an exciting standard story in the book about how Tim Berners-Lee's standards organizations work. This is the London Olympics, where at the beginning of the London Olympics, there was this, extravaganza showing the history of Britain and how Britain has helped the world, and it starts with the Industrial Revolution. And at the very end of it, Tim Berners-Lee comes out and sits at a 1996 computer and hits the button that established the World Wide Web. For some of us who are old enough, we actually kind of remember this. I think Kathy probably remembers using the first browser that we used here, Mosaic.
No, I don't remember Mosaic. I remember Emacs or something.
Oh, Emacs is actually, that's the Internet Engineering Task Force. That's an even earlier one. That's a little bit earlier. That's these guys. That's Nerds in Paradise. That's the other organization. But the web, the ability to send all those cute pictures and all of that sort of stuff, started in 1996 with Tim Berners-Lee. And so this is the stadium in London for the Olympics, where the culmination of everything Britain has done for the world is Tim Berners-Lee creating W3C, the Worldwide Web Consortium. So that's part of the third wave. Here's the other part of the third wave. So we've got this weird thing. We have global manufacturing in place by the 1980s, really kind of legalized by things like the WTO in the 1990s, but we have no regulation of global manufacturing because the governments of the most powerful country in the world have consistently refused to allow any regulation. That country is called the United States of America. So for those of you who are economics students, you've heard of things called externalities, negative externalities, bad things that happen as a consequence of markets operating. You know, and bad things that happen sometimes are things like people die, like all those steamships that blew up in the 19th century. And other bad things that happen are you know, workers get burned up in factories, and sometimes the environment gets destroyed. So, okay, with that in mind, in around 2000, you start having a number of institutional entrepreneurs who say, let's use the standardization process created by the engineers to deal with these externalities. And there are lots of people involved in this. Klaus Schwab, who you know from the World Economic Forum, is one of them, but I don't think he's as interesting as these two people. So this guy is a guy named Kofi Annan. He was head of the United Nations for a period of time, Secretary General. He's a guy from Ghana. He has an undergraduate degree from the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana, which is where I went to school too. So he's an engineer. And he's got a graduate degree from the Sloan School of Management at MIT, where his advisor was the person my wife replaced. So there's Kofi Annan, and Kofi Annan says, maybe we should have these committees of major producers, major consumers in the public interest, and we could create a set of standards for things like human rights, environmental, labor rights, etc., and people will voluntarily adopt them. So we've got this MIT guy, and then over here, this probably a person who's actually more important is this person, Alice Tepper Marlin, who created something called the Consortium for Economic Priorities. That's a group that was really the first group that came up with the idea that maybe shareholders should use their shareholder responsibility to try to influence outcomes of one thing or another. This stuff going back to the 1980s. And she also created an organization called SAI 8000, which is a standard for labor. And it basically says, here's a standard that you can voluntarily adopt if you are a company that's producing all the things that we're wearing all around the world. And you won't be doing terrible things to people if you adopt this standard, which we will monitor. And again, because of the group here, I showed a picture of Alice Tepper Marlin in a Turkish factory. So Alice Tepper Marlin, you should all know where she went to school. Wellesley College. Gosh. You know, anyway, so we have the Sloan School and Wellesley College, and these are kind of the key people of that set of activities. Okay, that's the current period, and now here are the two issues that come out of this. Okay, the internet is governed by something called the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the stuff that governs all those old layers of the internet that actually had text on it, and all of that sort of stuff, which, gosh, we both actually remember that, but we're not, but, you know.
Like green flashy.
Green flashy stuff. That's the Internet Engineering Task Force. They govern that, and that's a bunch of engineers, nerds in paradise. And the upper level, which is the stuff that's all cool and wonderful, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. These are the two things that do most of the governance of the internet. These are hated. by governments. If you go to chapter 6 in this book, there's a long case study where Joanne sat for 5 years in one of the World Wide Web Consortium's committees, most important committees, which is called Web Crypto. And Web Crypto is the part of the standards to maintain a part of the web where things can be secret. All right? So it was hilarious, but she was every Monday, she was working with nerds from all over the world, or at least listening to them, talk about maintaining this particular standard. Great chat. Governments hate this. Governments have, and this is I'm a political scientist, so I'm allowed to simplify. So the Chinese government hates this because they want to be able to control content and they want to be able to spy on any user. That's what they want the internet to allow them to do. They want to be able to make sure that people like me can't post on Chinese websites, because people like Tom Cushman, the founder of the Freedom Project, can't post on Chinese websites, and they want to be able to spy on all their citizens. Okay? The US government wants no controls on content because it believes in freedom, right? But it wants to be able to spy on users. They hated web crypto just as much as the Chinese hated web crypto, because they want to be able to spy on all of us to help with terrorism, which we'll be hearing about this afternoon, right? And they want companies to be able to spy on all of us. So Shoshone Zuboff, who is a professor of management, does kind of the same stuff Joanne does, but at the Harvard Business School, which is this kind of lesser business school that's down the river from MIT. She has a great new book about the way surveillance capitalism works. And the US, the US government, it doesn't matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans, even Bernie, basically would want to make sure that companies are able to make money by spying on us, right? Okay, so that's what. The European Commission, on the other hand, the folks around the Europe, wants European governments to be able to control some content. They're actually worried about having fascists use Twitter and Facebook to put fascist leaders in power, and the Russians, and that sort of stuff. So they want to be able to control some content. They want to be able to spy on users, at least in these conditions that have to do with terrorism, but very few. And they don't want companies spying on users. And those are like the most powerful 3 governments in the world. If you could get all of them to agree, you could probably get the internet to be controlled. But the engineers want a web with no controls on content and no ability to spy on users. So if there's one thing the Europeans, the Americans, and the Chinese governments agree, is they hate the system that currently governs the internet. Okay, so that's number 1 problem. Number 2, so I must say that this is one of these things that took Joanne and me a long time to come to this conclusion. My wife, Joanne, was born in Wichita, Kansas. You've probably heard of that place if you're a Freedom Project person. And her dad was a petroleum geologist, and they had family friends who were like these rich people called the Kochs. So, and she went to there's this like kind of right-wing crazy Christian high school that the Kochs established in Wichita, and Joanne was like in the 2nd or 3rd class at that school, and by far the smartest kid in the class and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, so we don't really like coming to this conclusion because we kind of were more like the Kochs. It turns out that there's this long history where voluntary standards just don't seem to work. Those steam boiler standards in the 19th century. Good steam boiler standards were established by the end of the 1870s in every industrialized country, and people still continued to die because companies were making money on those particular operations. And they didn't start working until the standards were adopted by governments. First by a set of German states, and then ultimately by pretty much everybody. Health regulations. Turns out that health regulations, another safety standard, there were all of these great standards about something called quarantine that had been established privately before 1919. And this is a story that's so much like today. It's so weird. The way you can stop diseases from going across borders real fast, like the ones that are going on right now, is basically having a system of monitoring where the disease is and quarantining, keeping people who have it away for periods of time. In the 19th century, we knew how to do that, but the British industry that controlled shipping around the world, transcontinental shipping, was controlled by British carriers. And they said these standards were meaningless. For one thing, they said there wasn't any science for them. The British asserted, and people from all the political parties in Britain would say, we know this from science, which was really weird because actually the British were the best, the British scientists were the best on infectious disease stuff at that time. And they were winning all the new medical prizes for the Nobel Prize, were actually Brits who were winning it. But the British industry was saying the infection theory of disease is a French and German idea that is wrong, and it's designed to harm British industry. Because it establishes quarantine, which, you know, is bad for British transportation. And it's true, there was a guy named Koch, actually, who was the German guy who came up with that, and then Louis Pasteur. And the British asserted, the industry asserted, disease was caused by miasmas, bad air. And there were just some places that had bad air. And just stopping people from moving from one place to another isn't going to stop the disease because it's bad air. Miasmas, they're called the miasma theory of disease. The British stopped doing this and stopped being concerned about this after the First World War, when the United States became top country, and when the British industry stopped being the industry ruling the all global transportation, and when the United States essentially said, let's all get together and establish what we now call the World Health Organization and deal with that. Do you see any similarities between that story and today? There's one of my friends who teaches at the Harvard Business School likes to tell this story over and over again because he says it's the same story as what you might know today. Okay, working conditions. Alice Tepper Marlin's SA 8000 labor conditions thing is wonderful, except for two things. One is the companies that adopt SA 8000 do it because they're trying to sell their products to people like me and my wife, who want to have goods that have been socially responsibly produced, like that factory in Turkey. And like God, you know, we actually, I think lots of people do this, but we actually spend a lot of time figuring out whether we're buying things that are socially responsibly produced. But those companies don't want the standard to become universal. If you're Patagonia, just like incredibly socially responsible company, the last thing you want is for Target, that other high quality firm, to adopt the same thing. Because you wouldn't be able to then have your higher price that you charge to college professors so that they can be wearing socially responsible stuff. So that's problem number one. And then problem number two is that the way SA 8000 is actually monitored, maintained, is you hire companies that are essentially like accounting companies to go and visit the factories. And there's an incentive for those accounting companies to cheat. And there were a couple of horrible disasters about 10 years ago in factories in Bangladesh and in Pakistan that were SA 8000 compliant. The accounting firms had said that the factories were just perfect. But it turned out the accounting firms, which in both cases were actually accounting firms associated with an Italian oversight company owned by Mr. Berlusconi, and then the people who were supposedly visiting the factories were from the United Arab Emirates, but there's no, anyway, lots of people died because the companies that were doing the private enforcement just weren't actually interested in doing it. Same thing then comes with environmental regulations. We have a huge set of standards about the environment that have been set by really smart people in these committees that have producers and consumer companies and all sorts of things. And we know, on the basis of those standards, we know how to do things like assess our carbon footprint. I mean, that's because of a voluntary consensus standards committee and all these little engineers. But the companies act just like the British shippers did in the 19th century. Companies that make their money in dirty industries, including, the Wichita producers of oil that my wife's father worked for, or that support the Freedom Project, have a vested interest in claiming that the science that the engineers use is invalid, and a vested interest in convincing all of us that it's invalid. That's why they spend the money on it. It's the same thing as happened in the 19th century. Reluctantly, I think both Joanne and I have concluded, based on this historical analysis, that when issues of safety come up, whether it's blowing up ships, or whether it's an environment that is destroying life, or whether it's health care, there is a role for government. You can't just do it through this voluntary system that really works incredibly well in many, 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 many other cases. Okay, that's the end. Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for this great and inspiring talk. Fun too. I would like to open the floor for discussion right now if you have any questions.
I must say, when I started teaching Wellesley in 1981, one of my first students, who I really, really, really liked, the first student I ever had from the People's Republic of China was in my first class. And her parents had been rusticated, but sent out during the Cultural Revolution. And I mean, talk about, yes, not a great system. So this is, I don't know what the right, thinking about the internet, what sort of the right answer is, but here's what the kind of European Commission kind of tries to argue. In fact, Joanne sent me something like 5 minutes before I came upstairs about this that I could probably send you. I mean, the Commission argues that the only content that the government should be allowed to control is situations where media platforms are being used are allowing the presentation of falsehoods which undermine the democratic system which is supposedly exists in Europe, right? So the European Commission would say that the situation in the United States right now, where in particular Facebook and Twitter allow political candidates and those to support them to lie, but don't allow private companies to lie, should be changed, and the political candidates shouldn't be allowed to lie either. So that's that, and it's a very interesting thing because we already have this kind of idea, both in Europe and the United States, that it's okay to find some way to regulate companies from lying about their products. I mean, it's okay, in both cases, it's not something where you can stand up ahead of time and say, you were lying about your product, and therefore, me, the government agency, is going to come in and say, stop saying that. In both Europe and the United States, it's a case where there's a judicial system where if the product has been lied about, that needs to be dealt with by either judicial or quasi-judicial work, and then you take it down. So the Europeans say that should apply to, that is the one thing that should apply to political speech. They also want to, like like everybody, all the other governments, in cases of terrorism, things where there are issues of terrorism, they want to be able to spy on people. And like the Americans, but perhaps not like the Chinese, they have set up judicial systems. You know, there are actually courts that allow, when governments come in to figure out whether people are communicating bad things from one place to another, there's a court that has actually figured that out because of probable cause. That system probably works a little bit better in Europe than it does in the United States, but it's a regulatory system. Again, there's a check on it, which is the existence of the court. So both of these would be cases with checks on them because of courts. The Europeans have a different idea about privacy than folks in the United States or folks in China do. I mean, basically these are cultural, simple sort of thing would be it's a cultural difference. In general, in Europe, people are much more concerned about privacy than people in the United States and in China. At least that's what the internet folks say. The engineers the engineers love privacy. The engineers and the nerds who run the internet, and they are most, I must say in the web crypto meeting, one of the things that Joanna and I kept noticing among the people who were there, so they were from all over the world, all these engineers were from all over the world, they were almost all men. They were almost all men in their early 30s or late 20s. The joke that Joanna and I had said that they all looked like Edward Snowden. There's a kind of a Korean Edward Snowden guy, there's a Zimbabwean Edward Snowden guy. I mean, they all had the same glasses, they were all thin, they're all very intense. And they share values across countries of people shouldn't be spying on, there should be places on the web where completely secure information can go. And it's not because they want to protect their bank accounts. It's because they want to protect their naughty ideas. There's many things about that idea that's very appealing. And they certainly don't want governments to be able to spy on people. And there are lots of things about that that are appealing as well. So these are, if I knew what I personally believed about this, I think I probably would say I think the Europeans have the best idea of this because that's the kind of thing that's been operating in the economies that in a variety of ways perhaps have produced the most consistent improvements in quality of life in my lifetime, in Western Europe, Scandinavia, et cetera. I probably lean toward them, but I actually know the arguments for all of these positions are really, really, really sensible. They're not crazy, even if I put them up in rather stark terms. Yeah.
What are the flaws with the European Commission's?
What's that?
What are the flaws with the European Commission's ideas?
Well, so the one that I guess I have and I'm going to sound very American, but I'm probably more of a person who thinks that a kind of almost absolute freedom about content is, content is a good thing. I tend to believe in these sorts of things. If there are bad ideas, bad thoughts and bad ideas, they can be argued away, and that would be. I think I'm kind of have many times a view of the Second Amendment, First Amendment, not Second Amendment, I have different views, but the First Amendment that are pretty stark, and I think that sometimes the Europeans go a little bit far. On the other hand, my European friends will say two or three things to me. One they'll say that you come from a country that didn't experience the Nazis or the fascists, right? And those systems, particularly the Nazis, I mean, in some ways Mussolini was a little different, but particularly the Nazis gained power by lying. And there's a very it recently passed away European political theorist Jürgen Habermas, who argues about a kind of tolerance of speech that becomes deeply repressive because it allows the kind of thing that the Nazi public relations machine did. And I'm sympathetic to that, but I wonder, and I don't work on this directly, but I wonder how to draw the lines. I really wonder about how to draw the lines. Yeah. So that for me, that's the biggest problem with Europe. The other thing is that I'm also a little bit more American than many of my European friends in terms of privacy. I think we could create an internet where there are places that are completely private and that actually work, without banning the business model that Facebook and all these others work on, which is a business model of spying on you. But I get why I get why the Europeans think that is a opening the door to restrictions on privacy that are one of the human rights that the European Union and the non-European Union states that are part of the European Court all see as essential human right. And so, okay, maybe I'm not.
Do you not see it as an essential human right?
Oh, God, isn't that weird? I don't know. I mean, I guess there's part. There's a part of me that sort of would say there is no such thing. We can never, we're social beings. We can never be completely private in any sense. We always rely and depend on others. We probably should be able to restrict information about ourselves to the communities of people with whom we have concrete, real, sensible, blah-blah-blah connections. I mean, some of the privacy things that I think that have, privacy rules in my own country, in the United States, that I think have made my life harder. When I started teaching at Wellesley, it was possible for a faculty member to talk with other faculty members about a student's work and her grades. That's not allowed. The United States has much stronger privacy ideas. I can't talk to your parents. I can't talk to another faculty member, etc. I think we actually did that more. I frankly think that, at least in my little department, the political science department, we probably taught more effectively in the early 1980s when we could share more information about students. And I think and I actually think our teaching is a collective endeavor. I mean, the idea that my personal teaching to you is somehow really important is ridiculous. I mean, what is really important is the institution as a whole, the group of people who are professionals in one field or another as a whole, and our teaching. So that's a case where it's like, privacy, this is my own country, and it's not the Europeans who will be much more restrictive about this sort of thing, and I can see that there's a downside to that as well. I mean, basically, I've been around long enough that I've now, even though I've just argued against all of that privacy thing, at least saying that I do think there was a cost to it. I think it's still a good thing, but there has been a cost. I think we actually, Kathy might have a totally different view, but I think we teach less effectively.
Oh, no, I agree with that. But, I don't think that in the Freedom Project we're such freedom absolutes.
I know. Just like I was creating
well, I have a question that's kind of related to that. Yeah. I mean, I was born in Los Angeles, the city of smoke, Yeah. One of my first memories is being unable to breathe. Before I was like 3 or 4 years old, having that catch in my lungs from the smog. And California did wonderful things cleaning up the air. So I believe that there are important environmental regulations. My husband is an environmental lawyer. He works for big corporations. He helps them comply. That's his job. We talk about this all the time. But I can also see, and partly this is from, being in the dean's office when we were doing a lot of construction projects on campus, that regulations can go too far. We had to install a sprinkler system over the swimming pool because it was connected or near another building that that was being renovated. If a building touches another building, you have to renovate everything. Part of the reason that we don't have sprinklers in this building because we can't afford to put sprinklers into these buildings that could, actually burn down a lot more quickly than the swimming pool building because it's too expensive. Once we touch anything, we have to do everything. And so regulations are like getting in the way of improving the environment. My question is like, yes, I think we can agree in principle the government has a role to play in protecting safety and the environment, but how do you keep it from playing too much of a role?
So I think I have one thing that we've learned from this that is an answer to that kind of issue. And one of the things, Joanna, I found really bizarre about this book is that ever since it came out, we have a number of audiences that are intensely interested in it, small audiences, and one of them is regulatory lawyers. So we had like 11 days of stuff with the Yale Journal of Regulation.
Yeah, I'm going to get this book from
about this thing. And the Europeans are actually better on some of these kinds of stupid things, like the sprinklers over the swimming pool, that are typical in the United States. So in the European, some of this is because they had the Second World War and then they had to rewrite how to govern everything, so they kind of updated a lot of stuff. So one of the things that happens across the European Union is that with a lot of safety standards in construction and almost everything else, what the European Union does is it adopts a private standard and then says, now, the thing that you need to do is either follow this private standard, which has been set intelligently, more intelligently than most of our regulatory standards in the US, which are actually set by government. They really don't know what they're doing. That's number one. Mm-hmm. So they point to a private standard, and then they say, you are not, your legal liability ends if you have, with complying with what the outcome of the standard is supposed to be. So if the standard is, I doubt if the European Union standard would probably say you have to have sprinklers in a swimming pool, but that's beside the point. But if it did, the outcome is what matters, which is that the swimming pool won't go on fire. And all you have to do is say, the standard says that these things are there so the swimming pool won't go on fire. We have water in our swimming pool, and you're fine. And so the U.S. regulatory lawyers, they're listening to this stuff and they're saying, they say, why can't the U.S., there's going to be a Supreme Court decision, if the Supreme Court's ever able to get back to doing normal things, there's going to, in 2020, there's going to be a case that's essentially going to be a number of plaintiffs asking for something like what the European Union does with this from the Supreme Court. And that's a better, I just know that's a better system. It's one that the lawyers don't seem to have any trouble with. They say they can figure out how to litigate and make money and all that kind of stuff with it, just as well as they can with this system. But it's less regulatory. There's a less of a regulatory burden. And I think one of the big things that we learned in this, again, one of the things we didn't expect on it, is that the regulatory burden in many things in Europe is actually less than in the US. And bizarrely, it's even in China it can be worse. Because in China, on at the provincial level, they have a bunch of stupid regulations for things like building, et cetera, that are just like the ones that they have in the United States. That are rules that come back from the era of the Communist Party, et cetera, that are not thought through. They haven't been, it wasn't engineers who set them, it was the Communist Party of whatever, Hunan. That there's a vested interest of the government in enforcing them in one way or another. And there's a group of engineers in China right now. One of my new really close friends is a guy named Wang Ping, who is like the Chinese standards guru, who's fighting against that regulatory thing and wants, as he says, we want to be like the Germans, which I've just described when I said that was the regulatory system. That's what he means. He would like to see that in China rather than the government of Hunan with their old Communist Party people saying we have to follow these stupid rules. One of my professors when I was in college, in graduate school, always faced with things like this, he would say, look, one of the things we human beings are not very good at is anticipating all of the problems that are associated with new technologies. And we're living in a period where we like to create lots of new technologies without thinking about whether they're good or bad. We just do them. And his general view, he sort of said two things. One is we should be forgiving of a lot of people who are trying to figure out how to make the technology regulated in such a way that it helps all of us. That would be the first thing he'd say. So, be forgiving to, maybe there are people who in the SARS, there are people who say the government went too far and it's monitoring and all that sort of stuff. So he'd say be forgiving, but he'd say also the most important thing is for there to be students, public health people, professors, whatever, who are conscious of the lessons that have been learned in every situation like this, and not tied to some, he would say Kantian, which is a bad way of putting it, but some, he'd say to be thinking about pragmatic ways of responding rather than trying to think of ways of responding that are associated with some universal principle which may have been invented at a time or applied from a time when this kind of situation didn't exist. So his two things would be, one, be a little forgiving to the people who screw up, because we don't know how to do it. That would be number one. Number two is learn from what's going on and try to develop pragmatically regulatory schemes that would work better. So that's my lessons. And Andrew Scott actually was the first one who came up with that. And Anne Scott. Yeah. Anyway, okay.
Okay, but for the people on the
Yeah, sorry.
go ahead. Back to the question of privacy.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you think there's whether in your view there's a distinction between because your answer was like you believe in some sort of right to restrict the info about ourselves to our communities. Would you differentiate that definition of privacy about towards companies and towards governments between communities, or would you say between companies? Because I think my biggest concern probably would be privacy from government, and also a second part of the question would be do you believe that it's a privacy to something or privacy from something?
I must say that when I think about privacy, and it may be because I don't think about it enough, I mostly think about privacy from. And that's, I'm sure that if I really thought, some of my European friends would be hitting me over the head and saying, this is part of your problem. Murphy, you don't think about privacy too. Okay, but okay, I think about privacy from, and I think that I wouldn't distinguish between governments, who are we trying to be private from, governments or private. I think we want to be private from government, and we also want to be private from corporations that are trying to use our information to do things that we don't want to have done. Yeah, I think that both of those are probably true.
Would your desire to have like privacy from government be stronger than your desire for privacy within your department, for example? Like
In some things, yes, in other things, no. I mean, you're going to be talking about terrorism this afternoon. And there...
But aren't the dangers greater?
From government?
Yes, than from a political science department sharing information among students? like
you know, the funny thing is, my intuitive off the top of the head answer would be no, they're not. I mean, private companies or organizations with even a political science department can do horrible harms to individuals, their reputations, they're really, they can create, we could do stupid things that would create irreparable, horrible relations between a student and her parents. I mean, so it sounds like a flip answer, and maybe one that isn't taking into account, yeah, governments have weapons and can kill you and all that sort of stuff, which they do.
And also just like the notion of governments making lists.
Yeah, I don't like it. I don't like governments making lists. I don't like governments using, but I do think that when, gosh, I've been watching Perry Mason too long and that sort of stuff. I do think that when there is probable cause that something that looks like a crime that is going to harm lots of people is about to take place, that it is worthwhile for government to have the right to tap into information that is being shared by people.
Wouldn't that make more sense for it to be like a privacy like from government, and then there be caveats about when government can overstep that boundary? As
I think that is probably a more practical way to get to probably where I would want to be. Yes. How about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do we do when people don't follow standards?
Well, yeah, what do we do when people don't? Then certain things don't work. That's so. I mentioned the International Electrotechnical Commission, which is really important and very, very successful because our networks of electricity, the fact that we can get electricity from Quebec when our electricity power work because of things that they've done. But I think something that all of you probably know is that our plugs don't work. Our standards, there is no standard for plugging our things into the wall around the world. There just isn't. And it's wasteful, and it's a pain in the neck, and it's all kinds of things, and there's a historical reason for it. And if you go to the International Electrotechnical Commission's headquarters, which are in Geneva, and if you're like one of the one tourist a day that actually goes there, I mean, everybody goes to Geneva and they go to the UN, and ILO, and that's the WTO. But if you happen to go to the International Electrotechnical Commission and you are in the tourist section, they have an ironic gift that you can buy, which is a universal translator, so that you can plug from, and it says IEC on the side, because this is a failure of standards. No standard is being followed. It's expensive, it's terrible, blah, blah, blah. Is that something where I think government should step in and create, that the UN should create a universal plug? No, because it's not going to kill anybody to have to change. It's wasteful and stupid, yes. But, wasteful and stupid are probably things that I don't want necessarily to have a government telling me to stop being wasteful and stupid. If it were something that was actually creating a situation where people would die, yeah, I would hope that what then happens is that at whatever level the government that would be needed, in this case it really truly would be at a global level of government, would step in, say that a single standard is going to be enforced, and have the enforcement mechanism to do that. The answer to macro level is the same as at micro level. When you don't have standards that are followed, for the most part, you can be assured that there will be a great deal of waste, that things will not be done as efficiently as they otherwise would be done. They might be done less boringly. I mean, you think there might be lots of things that are good for not following standards. I'm glad we don't have a standard curriculum at Wellesley that's exactly the same as Smith, for example. Frankly. But there's a wastefulness. We have to produce different textbooks from the two places, and that means that the textbooks cost more rather than costing less. So wastefulness, yeah. Resources and time will be greater. That's macro, as well as micro. In many of the kinds of cases that operate, with the way people use the internet to allow other things to happen, I wouldn't consider those things to be violations of standards. They might be violations of rules. The standards are actually, the kinds of things that have been set up by our friends at the IETF and the WC3, and what they have created an internet where it is possible to set up private VPNs. They created an internet where it's possible to have really strong encryption. It means that you can't tap into one place or another. The standards are actually things that allow the things that you're saying are happening. And what do I think? Do I think those are the right standards? The standards are still being followed because you can actually use them. What is kind of the opposite of that would be when Iran or Russia or China tries to create a local internet that operates by a different set of rules in such a way that you cannot connect to the rest of the world and cannot actually do many of these things. That's violating the standards. And yeah, that can be good. I mean, I can imagine that if I were a Putin supporter, I would want Russia to have just everybody think only Russian things and not have all these bad ideas coming from guys like you and Wellesley or something of that sort. I can imagine that would be great. But it would still be, again, in a more abstract way, wasteful in the sense that the amount, and this would be information theory, the total amount of information that could be flowing from one place to another would be less, and consequently the ability to find the information that you need would be less, blah, blah, blah. That ends up being wasteful. And it would therefore take more time and probably more other resources. Yeah. Yes?
What's something you think ought to be standardized but isn't?
Oh, plugs. All of the damn electrical connections, everything that we use for our computers and for our electrical systems, that would be way, way up. Sizes of women's clothes, that would be up on
Sorry, what do you mean, like size of women's clothes? Wait, like, sorry, can you just elaborate? Like, what do you mean?
Well, so that if you went into a store anywhere in the world and there was a number that was associated with, say, the size of a blouse, and it says 8,
yeah,
that no matter where you go, whether you're in Harare or whether you're in Bar Harbor or whether you're in Istanbul, an 8 would be an 8. I think that would be really good. Men's clothes are terrible, but they are much more standardized than women's clothes. And it's like, oh God. I mean, there's a level of stupidity, and it's like it is a way in which women are oppressed, I think. And it's it's wasteful and takes a lot more time. Yeah.
I'm curious though whether global standard setting affects patents in a way. There have been cases where some corporations...
You don't really want to get into this.
Some corporations have decided to withhold some information because that translates to patent violations.
Yes, it does. And I said that we found that there are these really intensely small but intensely interested audiences for this book. One of them are the regulatory lawyers. The other big group among legal people is the patent lawyers. So in the old days, like through those first two waves, so until World War II, there was a kind of norm of standard setting that said, excuse me, until 1980s, I should say, not until World War II. There was a norm of standard setting that said every time you create a standard, if the standard includes anything that is patentable, that you must give up your intellectual property rights. And like the exciting story of how we got the container standard, you can read about. It actually is kind of exciting. But the exciting story is ultimately about giving up, a company giving up its patent rights on the corner fixings in order to get the standard. Okay? Since the 80s, since the era of Reagan and Thatcher and what that horrible word that I'm not going to use, but it begins with neo. But anyway, since that era, it is now typical to include things that are patented in many standards. It started because of a technical thing which the Europeans found better ways to actually get people to be paid for patent and copyright. I mean, there's actually a technical reason why it became possible to do this. So now, one of the things that some companies want to do, is they want to figure out how to create items that will be standards essential things that have to go, that they have a patent for. So there's a business strategy. This kind of called the standards essential patent strategy, that there's no evidence that it works. There's no evidence that anyone has ever figured out how to do this. I mean, we know that there are companies that have figured out how to create standards that they force on other people like Microsoft, but that is by not allowing standards to be formed in another way. But trying to put them into standards doesn't seem to work, but there are lots of companies that try to do that. And there's a whole set of organizations in Chapter 7, I didn't talk about. There's a whole huge set of company consortia where companies work together and create a standard that's different than the standards that are sort of set through the other mechanism, but that has the patent of one company or another within it. And they operate the same way as the ISO and that sort of thing, except they restrict the number of companies that are there who are producers and consumers, and they have these standard essential patents. And there's one lawyer here in Boston who is really the inventor of this, who has created almost all of the organizations that work in that way. And he's a really nice guy, and there's lots of reasons why it isn't a problem, but it's a different way of doing things. I think Joanne and I have the sense that this consortia system may very well disappear, that there's kind of a social survival of the fittest, and if you can't actually figure out how to make money on your standards essential patent, then it's going to disappear. And it takes a lot of time, because you don't have that many people in your company that can actually work on standard setting. And so if you're working in this kind of private area that's protecting some patent, it means you're not working on things that might actually be more important to your company later on. So it may just be a temporary thing that disappears. We may be completely wrong about that, but it's very big now. And yes, there are lots of lawyers who are making lots and lots of money. And if Joanne were willing to teach a strategy course at Sloan about the business strategies for doing this, you'd get tons of students taking the class, but they'd hate the class because she'd say, empirically, we can't really point to any companies that have actually been successful at this sucker yet, but except for very short periods of time. Yeah, it's a big change. And again, the patent people love this. We did big thing with them 1 week too. Yes, very good question. Yeah.
In a part of your lecture, if I remember correctly, you said that the culture of these countries are shaping their policies on privacy.
Yeah, I think they are. Yeah.
By culture, do you mean their historical experience, or do you mean their ideologies, political worldviews, or something like that? Can you elaborate?
I think that the first thing I mean is their ideology, political point of views. The first thing I think about is we have survey research. I know there are all kinds of problems with survey research, but we have a significant amount of survey research done by some people at the Kennedy School about privacy concerns in different parts of the world, and they differ from place to place. Their attitudes differ from one place to another. Secondarily, I think that there are some pretty good historical explanations for these things. I mean, you can make you can tell a good story connecting the experience of China with a period of kind of impoverishing authoritarian communist government, even though perhaps it was a well-meaning communist government, and various ideas about how privacy, whether it should be significant or not significant today. You can certainly tell a story about Europe, which is one that I sort of partially told, which is thinking about the rise of fascism and the horror of the Second World War, that kind of relates to some of those things. Do we really know that that's why the attitudes are the way they are? I don't think we do. No. But yeah, it's the attitudes is the first thing.
Can I use my privilege to ask one question?
You can.
I was wondering, how would you envision the future of private standard setting, standardization in the face of climate crisis, ecological crisis? Where does the future lie there?
Yeah, I think that I actually have some pretty good ideas about that. I think that one of the private standard setting system, this network of organizations with the ISO at the top and these national groups and all that sort of stuff, it has already and will continue to do really important work to make a regulatory system, whatever the regulatory systems that are chosen, be effective. And that you can't do it without this system probably, because in fact governments don't have even the ability to assess things like your carbon footprint. No government, and I really mean no government, has the expertise within the government to do that. And NOAA would say that in the United States, that the group of scientists in the US would be the most associated with that. You really have to bring in the private sector to help with assessing how to do those things. And that's actually what the system does. My guess is, you're already seeing this in a number of places, that you're going to see more and more climate-based regulation that refers to private standards, where governments say, the government of California has been doing this recently, where governments say, we have a variety of different goals that require organizations of all sorts, including colleges, folks who have buildings and that kind of stuff, to abide by certain outcome levels associated with carbon and other things. And instead of the government telling people at UCLA or something to go figure out what the regulation is, they'll refer to existing standards. And there's a wonderful, as I say, there's an incredible set of these standards already. The committees that are working on them, which there are always these specific stories that we know. It turns out that that's a place where German-Chinese cooperation is really, really important, because that's actually a lot of the expertise, believe it or not, is in companies in Germany and China, and that's actually a place where a lot of this stuff is coming from. That those standards will be pointed to by legislation and an essential part of it. I've told a couple of students of mine recently who are interested in environmental internships in the summer, who are interested in policy making, and they say, oh, do you think I can get an internship at the UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program? And usually the answer is no, because everybody in the world is trying to get that. But, you know, if you wanted to get a summer internship working on environmental standards through the German National Standards Bureau, which is acting as the secretariat of a number of the committees, or through the Norwegian National Standards Bureau, which is acting as the secretariat for a number of committees, or even through ANSI, which is the American one, who has appointed the gas something or other group to be the secretariat in the US's name, you could probably get an internship where you would actually be doing something that is really relevant to policy outcomes, which you would not be doing even if you were working in the Secretary General's office, let alone in the EPA right now. So, yeah. Yes?
So I'm really inclined to ask this question. I hope I can ask it in the best possible way. You talk about the Chinese government, US government, the EU, but I was thinking, I brought this conversation to Africa.
Yeah.
Also, and I guess specifically Ghana because I'm from Ghana. So Ghana has a mixed economy generally.
Yes.
It's not entirely capitalist and it's not really like communist or socialist either. And Ghana is also a colony, or it has colony.
It's still a colony in certain ways, I think that's right. I was a student in Ghana, so,
Yes. So I think this whole topic of standardization is critical because when I think about it, Ghana is not necessarily at the level that the US and China or EU are in terms of standardization, how many things they've been able to standardize and in like the most quality way. But in terms of beginning that conversation of standardization, I'm wondering what you think, if it is more practical to adopt the standards that have already been set by Western powers, which would be playing into continuing on in living in this kind of oppressive state of Western powers having all the influence, but also thinking about the flip side, which is that finding or generating our own authentic standards might go contrary to what is already accepted universally, or by universally I mean by like the Western hemisphere. What do you think?
So I'm going to say a couple of things that are just to the side of what you're saying before answering it directly. One thing on the side, when you talk about the negotiations like the Paris negotiations that are intergovernmental negotiations about like climate change goals, the way those negotiations take place is effectively there are maybe 6 really important negotiators in those negotiations. And one of the negotiators is the negotiator for the group of 77 plus China. And he's a man by the name of Professor Lumumba Kasanga, who is from South Sudan. And he has a degree from Yale, and he was actually one of the people who, when we were creating the global governance program at the UMass, he was one of the people we brought in to try to help us figure out how to do this. And he has had probably more influence as an individual on Chinese points of view, probably than any other individual. So a guy from South Sudan, kind of. And, he gets in trouble a lot. He gets in trouble a lot because he says that climate change has already created genocide in Africa. Most recently, when he was talking about the forest fires in Australia, and said, we've had that already on the continent. But anyway, so that's aside number one. Second thing, it's essential for Africans to be represented in international standard setting. Absolutely essential. this is even before answering your question. So that is to say, and this is something that not everybody in the standard setting business gets, but some people really do, like that crazy Swedish guy actually got this. You can't just assume that representation on particular things like environmental standard setting can be done just by representing the big companies that produce things, the big companies that buy them, and then some college professors from the global north. That doesn't work because there are different interests, not just in terms of quality of life or whatever, but also because of cultural differences in different parts of the world. And you need to set up a process that works. And again, there's another story that's long beyond what I was able to talk to here about the degree to which that is happening. It's not happening perfectly by any stretch of the imagination, but it is sort of happening in the standard setting. It needs to be really pushed more and more. One of my wife's former students runs Unilever in Ghana, and she's got it has to be pushed from many different levels. But yes, but then the final thing is, yeah. One of the things that is good, so this is going to sound weird, but one of the things that's good about the way the Europeans think about standards, so remember I said that the Europeans have this kind of notion that governments point to standards and adopt them and then say there are many different ways that you could possibly get there, and you could follow different standards but get to the same end. On a lot of things that, especially that are associated with climate change issues, there are many ways to get there. And while there are things that everywhere in the world, even in countries like Ghana, industry is going to need to, and industry even understood as relatively small agriculture, is going to have to change things to correspond to not producing as much carbon. I think that's right. The kind of thing that should exist at the global level is a statement that says, we want this thing achieved, and you can figure out any way to do it. And yeah, I would say Sahelan countries, for example, which includes northern Ghana, have a fundamentally different way of doing a lot of the things that could come out than other parts of the world. And that's really important for work to be done at that level. The final thing, I've written an article that, and this speaks to this a little differently. I've written an article that's going to come out in Globalizations, which is a journal about global governance and political economy. What the global standard for thinking about carbon emissions are, I think it should be the sort of same standard worldwide. That we all probably get a certain amount of carbon emissions that our particular life creates, and we need to stay within like 1/8 billionth of the total amount that would keep the planet from frying, right? Because there are 8 billion of us around the world, and each of us need to do that. That means I need to cut my carbon emissions by about 95%. That means somebody in Ghana, somebody in Accra who's got a fancy house and a car doesn't need to do anything. Because even for like the person with a fancy house and a car in Ghana, they're putting less carbon into the air than I am with my weird place that I'm employed, my airplanes that I fly from one place of the world to another, my summer moving my family to the shore for a period of time, blah, 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 blah. So those need to be the standards. And this is actually, Lamont Kasanga talks about how this is like the thing, something like that, not the particular way I framed it, but anything that talks about the differential ways we need to think about that, are things that most people in industrialized societies haven't gotten around. Their heads haven't quite figured out that the problem is not in Ghana. The problem is in Massachusetts. Yeah. Right. Anyway.
Thank you.
Although, if Ghana keeps producing all that oil and a whole bunch of other things, Ghana is going to be part of the problem too. But
There are lots of things we have to figure out. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Do you have any other comments or questions? Is there anything that you might? We tired you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's
Thank
give
you
a little
for.
clap.